Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ukraine is being destroyed before our very eyes, but the West's mainstream media will have nothing to do with this cruel reality. Actually, the mainstream is in lockstep with State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki. She doesn't know much about anything, particularly history, politics, and geopolitical facts. But one thing is undeniable. She certainly has no sense of humanity when a Washington-backed government kills its own people. To crosstalk the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Diana Johnston in Paris. She is an American political writer. In Berlin, we have Ole Brueckner. He is a political analyst and a Jean Monnet professor for European studies. And in New York, we cross to Eric Draitser. He is a geopolitical analyst and founder of StopImperialism.org. All right, crosstalk rules. And in fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Eric, if I can go to you first in New York, we're doing this program on Ukraine, obviously, but through the lens of, through the world of Jen Psaki. What is your take of the way she is reporting from the State Department?
Well, I think it's interesting because in many ways she embodies the U.S. foreign policy establishment, that is to say, arrogant beyond belief, but utterly uninformed when it comes to world affairs, when it comes to world history, and when it comes to the geopolitical and strategic reality of the U.S.-Russian relationship. In many ways, of course, her role is to be a propagandist. It is to be a mouthpiece for the State Department. But in effect, what she is a symbol of U.S. foreign policy. She is a symbol of a blundering foreign policy, I would add, by the Obama administration. And in fact, I think that the entire episode in Ukraine, really from November of 2013 and the association agreement, I think illustrates quite clearly what the United States political establishment is really all about. It is about leverage, it is about power politics, and most importantly, it is not interested in things like democracy, international law, the rule of law, or any of these other high-minded notions. And I think that Psaki's sort of behavior in recent weeks and recent months is really a good indication of that. They're not interested in truth and peace. They're interested only in power and hegemony.
Uli, in watching these State Department briefings, they don't even like to answer questions. They just deflect everything, and when facts are thrown at them, they could dismiss it as propaganda or somebody else's opinion. It's really, as Eric said here, I mean, it really comes out as a reflection of American foreign policy. It just doesn't like to be challenged, and it doesn't like to be interrogated. And by the way, Europe follows along Washington.
I don't think it is a fair treatment to just pick a random position of someone and start some sort of a propaganda war here. I spent the whole morning in various European Union-related events, and the Ukraine was very high on the agenda. If you look through German media, Obama's visit in Warsaw shows that there is a clear commitment to do something for de-escalation. And I think it's not just a question of showing pictures and blaming who's right and who is wrong, but rather to find a common denominator for a dialogue and not to exchange mutual accusations.
Well, okay, but that's what the U.S. State Department does all of the time, and it is escalating the problem in Ukraine. It backed an illegal coup. These are things Western media and the State Department don't like to talk about, but we do on this program. Diana, if I can go to you in Paris here, you know, they do frame all of these things as being very black and white. I mean, it's all Russia's fault. There's no agency of the people in Ukraine, particularly in the east. It must be somehow their fault that civilians are being killed by these militias that are supported by Washington.
Well, I would like to stress another point, which is that how they act, they don't know anything. But in fact, all of this was planned. It was all planned last September. In September 2013, there was a conference held in Yalta that was called the West Eastern Bilderberg, which was financed by an oligarch, Viktor Pinchuk. And the Economist reported at the time that it was deciding the future of Ukraine. And Hillary Clinton was giving a speech, and Tony Blair was there, and Shimon Peres was there, and General Petraeus was there. A dozen U.S. officials, all of the big names of Western policymaking, and they were there to plan the future of Ukraine. And so this was no surprise. And there was one poor Russian there who Forbes said was the one realistic person who said what this would mean for the economy of Ukraine, that it would be a disaster. Forbes reported that. But other than that, the Russian was warning that this would be an economic disaster, and also saying that this was a red line for Russia. So that everything that has happened since, and Russia's reaction was perfectly foreseen by the American policymakers, and they decided that despite all that, they were out to make a new Cold War. And I think all of this is absolutely intentional, and it was planned.
Okay, Eric, I agree with a lot of what we just heard there, but they didn't do a very good job. I mean, I know what their end goal was, but they haven't gotten there, and they will not get there. And the whole process of getting there has been one stumble after another. But it's all being painted as, well, Russia started all of this, which is a patent lie.
Yeah, I would agree with that point, and I would also stress that in many ways, Diana is absolutely correct in terms of the planning of all of this operation, and certainly with regard to an operation of this magnitude, you can never foresee all of the different outcomes, all of the variables that go into this sort of an equation. I think that to a large extent, the establishment of the West truly believed that they could either get Timoshenko back into power, or that they could get some other, perhaps more friendly oligarch. Poroshenko seems to toe some kind of a middle line, although he's certainly interested in NATO and interested in courting the West. So really, I think that these distinctions are somewhat secondary in importance. And I also agree with the idea that the purpose was to not only dislodge Ukraine and pull it into the Western sphere of influence, but that this was to use the 25-year policy of NATO expansion as the lever through which they would achieve all of these goals. And yes, of course, the corporate interests are certainly involved. Everyone from Monsanto and ConAgra to BP and Chevron, interested in fracking, interested in the agricultural sector, interested in picking apart piece by piece the assets of the Ukrainian state. All of that is absolutely true. But the geopolitical reality is something that was not simply planned a few months ago. This is a part of a long-standing policy of NATO's expansion for the purposes of containing and ultimately dismembering Russia. And I think that the major equation here, or perhaps the wrinkle in the equation, is that they did not foresee the countermeasures enacted by President Putin and by Russia, and that is what has changed the calculus of all of this.
Uli, you know, Europe always talks about democracy. How is Brussels helped democracy in Ukraine?
Let me first come back to what the previous speaker said. The pendulum swings from pure ignorance, the West has no clue what's going on, to a conspiracy which we now see being executed as some sort of an imperialist force. The European Union is not an imperialist organization, and I don't think, aside from a few people in Poland for historical and for their geopolitical position, no one in the European Union would like to see the Ukraine becoming a member of the club. So what they would like to see in the future as some sort of a helping hand is to come back to the negotiation table and to find a common denominator between the package that was offered to
yeah, but
the
Uli,
Ukraine
we've already been there, Uli. It was called February 21st. Remember the agreement brokered by the European Union, and then it broke its word? You can't go back in time.
Well, you can always go back to the negotiation table and find a solution which is acceptable for Russia, the people in the Ukraine, and the people in the European Union. This is the only possible solution.
Well, of course, that's the only way it's going to work, but Washington says no, 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 and Brussels is saying exactly the same thing. I respect your opinion, but that's not the reality right now. Diana in Paris, go ahead.
Well, you know, I looked up Ulrich Brucker, and I see he's talked about bridges. Now, the obvious natural role for Ukraine was to be a bridge, because it's a country that actually has been extended too far to the east and too far to the west, so that you don't have a unified country. You have a part that really is culturally part of Russia, and you have a part that wants to be part of the West. And so the natural role from a European point of view was that Ukraine would be a bridge. And the point is that the U.S. does not want that. And the European Union is going along with a policy that I would maintain is totally against European interests. The European interests are to develop trade with Russia and to have good relations with Russia and have a peaceful continent. The U.S. policy, it's been declared by theorists and so on, is to prevent a united continent and to make to use Ukraine not as a bridge but as an obstacle by forcing Russia to defend itself, which it had to do given the aggressive move of the European Union. Because why were all of those American officials there?
Yeah.
It wasn't just because, I mean, this is supposed to be about a European deal. And all those Americans there, because what they're interested in is extending NATO. And that's their main concern. And their main concern is to get NATO surrounding Russia as much as possible. And so they were at cross purposes, and that's why Victoria Nuland used bad language speaking about the European Union, because the Americans have their own goal, and the Europeans are simply following against their own interests.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the crisis in Ukraine. Okay, Eric, let's go back to bullhorns of propaganda. Let's go back to the State Department here. They talk about democracy. They talk about civil society. They talk about a European future for Ukraine. But the people that are running the shop right now hardly hold any of those values. But the West never tells their audiences that, or voters.
Well, that's correct, and I think that it's a good starting point would be the $5 billion figure that Victoria Nuland admitted regarding U.S. investments in so-called civil society in Ukraine going back a number of years. And so what you've seen then is that the United States and its Western partners have thoroughly infiltrated so-called civil society and the so-called democratic institutions of Ukraine. And I think we should also add that the United States, of course, is not interested in democracy. The United States is only interested in its own interests, and when democracy, or the veneer of democracy, serves its interest, then it trumpets that and it champions it, and when it doesn't, it will not. And so that's why you see a clear hypocrisy in terms of the U.S. attitudes towards the recent vote in Ukraine, in which Poroshenko became the new president, and the vote in Crimea, and the votes in Donetsk and the other regions. Those votes, those democratic processes and electoral processes that don't conform to the U.S. State Department foreign policy line, they will not recognize. And we see this all over the world as well, whether you want to talk about Zimbabwe, whether you want to talk about Libya, whether you want to talk about any number of examples. Elections and democracy are merely a tool of U.S. foreign policy in order to further its own agenda. And if I could go back to a previous comment that was made with regard to Europe and the European agenda, it's not simply that the European Union is an imperialist entity, as the other speaker had mentioned, but that the European Union is part of a larger system, that it is an integral component of a U.S.-dominated, but not exclusively a U.S. imperial system, one that is pushing towards the doorstep of Russia, putting strategic missiles in Eastern Europe to menace Russia, moving towards an outright confrontation, and Europe has followed along lockstep. And this is one of the tragedies of the European establishment.
Uli, would you like to respond to that?
Well, a month ago, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of eastward enlargement of the European Union. And if we compare the situation in Poland and the Ukraine not so long ago, they were about on the same level of economic development. If we now compare Poland with the Ukraine, one can clearly see that we do have a broad variety of civil society institutions that people in Poland identify with. Their level of income raised dramatically. They managed to survive the financial crisis much better than anyone who was not part of the system. So one can clearly show by the facts and by the figures.
Yeah, but Uli, does your system accept having fascists in power? Do you think that? How does it reflect? How does the European Union respect a government in Kiev that came about illegally, has known fascists in it, and you're just building another little Europe there?
But wait a minute. I want to jump in.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead, Diana.
I want to jump in.
Go ahead.
Because that Poland argument was exploded by precisely the Forbes journalist back in September, saying that using the comparison with Poland is completely unrealistic, because Poland was not in the terrible financial state that Ukraine is in, and that it's more reasonable to look at what has happened to Croatia and Slovenia, who actually were very prosperous and have become much less prosperous in the European Union.
Okay,
Poland
all right, Diana, let me jump in here, because I think we're getting off the point here. We're getting off the point here. Let me go back to Eric, because Ukraine is in a civil war. Let's not talk about GDP indices right now, okay? Eric, this is where it's going to, and this is part of the plan, most likely, or one of the contingencies, that if you can't get all of the country, trash it.
That's correct, and that's been U.S. policy for many, many years. Managed chaos, crisis management. The United States, if it cannot effect a regime change, a successful regime change operation, such as you saw, say, in Libya, then the secondary target, the secondary motivation would be to create a chaotic situation where no particular leadership can emerge, where there cannot be independent economic development, and when there cannot be a functioning state. And that seems to be the direction that all of this is heading in Ukraine. And I would also add something very important that I don't think anybody else is mentioning, or if they are, I haven't heard it yet. And that is the fact that what the so-called government in Kiev is doing is an outright war crime, because in the Nuremberg Principles and in the Geneva Convention, there are specific references to collective punishment, to the punishing of a civilian population for political and or military and strategic goals. And that is precisely what is happening in the east of Ukraine. The military, under the authority of Kiev, they have not controlled or asserted control over Donetsk, over Lugansk, over Mariupol, over any of these cities in the east. They're not gaining any territory. They're not pacifying a population. They're not doing anything other than killing civilians and killing self-defense forces. This is undoubtedly collective punishment, and it's time somebody started throwing around war crimes charges against the government in Kiev and its patrons in the West.
Uli, why doesn't Brussels speak out more forcefully about the killing of civilians in Ukraine? Let me go to Berlin. Go ahead.
Well, Brussels speaks out in a cacophonic orchestra, which is part of the pluralistic nature of the European Union. And that's the good idea of the Western-type democracy with its freedom of expression, that you can literally hear every possible voice in
but Uli, I'm talking about people being murdered. I'm talking about civilians being murdered. Why doesn't Brussels speak out? Because the American White House doesn't seem to care. It's your continent.
Well, you know as much as everybody else knows that this is about the integrity of territory. And this is the monopoly of the state executing its force. If there are separatist movements, every country of this planet would fight back. This is a very simple principle, and it doesn't need an additional educational initiative.
So then why does the European Union call it a crime when Bashar al-Assad does it?
Go ahead, Eric.
So then why does the European Union say that it's a crime when Assad, fighting a civil war in his own country, is doing precisely the same thing?
Uli, do you want to respond to that?
We are making all kind of interesting,
interesting
comparisons. When I'm comparing the
Libya?
Ukraine with Poland, it's an illegitimate comparison. You guys compare the situation in the Ukraine with Zimbabwe and Libya and whatever you like.
Okay, well, yes, these are regimes killing their own people, and they're being backed by the United States and the European Union. Paris, let's go to Donna, please.
Yes, I was going to say, obviously, the United States didn't feel that the Serbs were justified, although Serbia was a democratically elected government, by the way. It didn't think that Serbia was correct in keeping Kosovo within Yugoslavia. Then you can go to other governments, but that was a European government which was bombed by NATO, and for simply wanting to keep its country together. So I don't think this is serious at all. But what I'm saying about making an obstacle between Europe, if Ukraine is bogged down in civil war, which it looks to be happening, that creates an endless barrier between the European Union and Russia, because all of the hype is to make Russia the enemy and for being responsible for things for which it's not responsible, and that is the way to keep Europe and the continent divided and ruled by U.S. hegemony. That is U.S. policy, and it is using Ukraine one way or another to separate Western Europe from Russia in a hostile manner, with all this terrible Russia bashing, all of these columnists writing horrible articles about Russia and Putin and so on. It's a Cold War hype all over again.
Okay,
and
all
of
right.
course, meanwhile, the U.S.
Let me jump in here. I want to ask all of you. Let me jump in here. I want to ask all of you the same question here, starting with Eric. Okay, Mr. Putin is going to go to Normandy for the commemoration of the Allied invasion of Europe during the Second World War. If there's a photo op of those leaders that are there and Mr. Putin's there, what will the caption say?
The caption would say, at least from Putin's perspective, the caption would say, make sure you smile, make sure you smile, make sure you smile, because Putin is not interested in escalating a diplomatic and a geopolitical conflict any further than it already is. The sad fact about what has happened in Ukraine is what Putin said all along, that the West and Russia are intimately connected economically and financially, and that it is not in anybody's interest to sow chaos in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Ukraine, which is so vital. And so Putin is looking, obviously, to find a way to de-escalate tensions while at the same time not conceding any of the most critical points regarding Ukraine. That being that Ukraine must remain neutral, must remain non-aligned, that the rights of Russian speakers in Donetsk and in the eastern regions must be respected, and that some kind of a federalized system wherein the regions have some degree of autonomy must be maintained, so that at the very least Russia's interests, particularly with regard to the gas pipelines that they have in Ukraine, but not exclusively that interest, are of course furthered. And
okay, Eric,
let
me ask Uli the same question. Okay, you have all these leaders in Normandy. Photo op. What's the caption?
Well, I fully agree with Eric that de-escalation is the priority of the day. And if they find a solution, no matter who's initiating it, this is what the country urgently needs.
Okay, Diana, last word, real quick.
Well, no. I wish that they would use the meeting to remember that it was Russia that defeated Nazi Germany, which had invaded Russia. And Russia is not the expansionist power. Russia gave up its empire.
Okay, on a very, very optimistic note, thank you very much. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Paris, Berlin, and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.